And we are live. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another session of Sessions with Flow. I am your host, Flo, of course. Today, we're going to be covering a very important topic that a lot of folks have, you know, been asking about or just wanting to hear about in regards to the podcast. I know the last couple of episodes, they've been a little less raza specific or just, towards our community or whatever, which I think they still are, but this one is a little more specific to us. So I definitely wanted to cover this because, the argument of, who really owns this land or the land we now call the U.S. Southwest. It has gone through many, many changes, in the last, 13,000 years, if you want to go that far back. So this is why I wanted to cover this topic. The specific session will give you a lot of history. If you're into history, you're definitely going to be intrigued with some of the stuff I'm going to talk about. If you're not, then, too bad, you know what I mean? But overall, it's informative, and especially because, like I said, a lot of people claim that this land belongs to Native Americans, and some folks say that this land really belongs to Chicanos and Chicanas, and you have Minutemen and white supremacists who say that this land actually belongs to them, so we're going to dive into all that, into all the details about the U.S. Southwest, the real history about it. I know that, some of you probably have some background information to it, but, some stuff might be propaganda. Some stuff might be, not the actual truth. There's some stuff missing. And that's why I wanted to cover this topic because, and again, everything that I'm going to say is going to be cited. So you'll have a chance to look at it yourself. And, if you don't believe me or agree with me, go look at the sources. This is where I'm getting it from. Okay. So again, the land, right, that we now call the Southwest, right? We're first going to start with the past, right? Where it started. Okay. So when we're talking about the Southwest, we're talking about the states, that are in the Southwest. So California, right? Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Texas, those states that today has a lot of raza living in them, right? A lot of people from the Spanish speaking community reside in these states. So, but has it always been this way? Has our presence always been here? We're going to be talking about that in a minute. But before that, obviously, before any European ever made, their presence known here, in this area we now call the Southwest, it belonged to many, many, many native groups, right? And I know that the indigenistas, or people who are more with that philosophy, are quick to say that this is native land, but we're going to get into that in a second too, right? So just looking at California alone had about 70 different groups of native peoples, right? Different languages. So different nations, if you want to call them that, right? But in California, it didn't really have any large settlements that, compared to other native societies like, in Mesoamerica or even in the Mississippi area or just other parts of the Americas. You had mainly hunter-gatherers, right? You had small villages, obviously, right? You had some agricultural, communities, but for the most part, they were not. They were hunter-gatherers. They moved with, depending on the climate, depending on, what the weather was like or whatever the situation. So just in California alone, I mean, you had so many different groups of native peoples that you didn't have a California nation, a native nation. Some of the, significant ones, obviously, that I'm aware of are the Tongva people here in Los Angeles. I was raised in Pacoima, and that is a Tongva, word. And obviously the Chumash, from the Malibu area as well. the Titavium, I think that's how you say it. Uh, but of course, the Spanish give them different names, right? But these are just some of the villages or just nations of people that lived in the region now we now know as Los Angeles. But again, these communities were not huge. They were, yes, they had people, they had villages, like I said, but they were not huge centers like you had in other parts of Mesoamerica, right? In Arizona, you had, three major groups, one of them being the Navajo, of course, right? And in New Mexico, it is, believed that the oldest culture, right? That's really the mother culture of all native cultures, the Clovis, people, or Clovis culture. Um, you know, it is believed that this is the oldest remains of native peoples. There's a debate, right, as to really when it is, but if I'm correct, it goes back to 13, thousand years ago, So they've been here for a very, very long time. And again, it is believed that that is one of the mother cultures of all native nations in what we now call the Southwest, and really probably all the Americas, right? And one of the major groups that really had a more well-developed society in the Southwest was, the Pueblo peoples, right? Different groups were, they're called Pueblo for a reason, because when the Spanish, encountered them, they noticed that, the closest thing they could describe these areas were similar to pueblos that, that they had encountered in different parts, or maybe even in their own, countries or whatever, But that was probably the most well-developed society in the Southwest. They had different names, the Anasazi, right, the Hopi, all these different native groups existed in that area. So they had, a larger claim to the land than all the other native groups. And I say that because, land ownership, or just the way we look at land, is totally different than the way native peoples looked at it. Native peoples didn't really see themselves as owners of the land, but really being part of it. So that's another reason why you didn't really see native nations, at least the hunter-gatherer nations, fighting over territory as much as you would see Europeans, or even other more, bigger societies in Mesoamerica, right? And then you had the Comanche in Texas. Comanche were a force. If Comanche warrior, if you were here listening to this live, you'd be pretty proud of this. But the Comanches, they were a force, with not just Europeans, but really with all native peoples. They impose their wills, their will, and then they even went as far as south as present day Mexico, So they raided for the most part. And that's how they got around, But yeah, I mean, this is the some of the groups that existed in the Southwest. Of course, is way more, and I'm not going to cover all those groups because there's not enough time for that, and I'm not doing a lesson on just native, indigenous, Southwest. But it is a point to make that they obviously were the first here, before anybody. But again, the way they looked at land was not the same the way Europeans look at land, or even quote unquote colonized peoples. And that's going to play a major role as to why they were not able to fully control these areas, right? As far as oldest settlements, just in the Americas, and specifically in the Southwest, obviously the oldest would be, and major settlements, right? Would I be the Hopi in the 1100s, right? So that'd be one of the oldest settlements in the Southwest. So way before any Europeans, ever arrived on the scene. And then the second oldest settlement in the Southwest, that again, big settlement with a lot of people, was Española, and obviously settled by the Spanish in 1598 in what is now New Mexico, right? And then the Mexicans, when they took over the land after gaining independence from Spain, it would be Victoria in 1824. And if I'm correct, that's in Texas, modern day Texas. And then shortly after that, the Anglos came, and in 1835, they established Austin, Texas, right? So these are some of the oldest settlements based on groups, right? So each group, has a claim to this land. Like I said, I mean, all of these groups claim that this is home to them, right? That they own the land. And again, we're going to look at, what that really means in a second. Okay, so before I do that, I want to look at some of the comments. Lord Nemesis, always supporting. Thank you very much for coming in here. Sporting Sundays, best looking, sharp homie. Thank you. Appreciate you. And Patemoc Official, hey, it's been a minute, man. It's been a minute. I'm glad you're back in here. It's been a minute since you've been on the live, so you can learn a lot today about this. All right. So going back to settlements, right? So again, like I said, the native peoples of the Southwest didn't really have large settlements. So when the Spanish arrived, they saw a lot of land and they saw it as quote unquote empty. So just like when they arrived in other parts of the Americas, even though they were more populated, they, their goal was to bring the faith of Christianity to these people, to take control of the area and exploit the population to, bring riches back to Spain, obviously, right? And the majority of these people who came were soldiers in the very beginning, right? So, for example, New Mexico, which is the oldest, like I said, settlement in the Southwest, a lot of them were soldiers, who came, and actually with native allies, right? Or maybe not allies, but people they captured in Mesoamerica. So you would actually see, Mexica or, Mayan or just Chichimeca natives with them, accompanying them on these trips to dominate other native groups. That was very common, right? Once they were conquered, they would use them to also dominate other native peoples. So, there could be people here in the Southwest who have ancestry that goes back to the Mexica people, but they came here, because they were told after they lost the battle, hey, you're going to come with me and capture other people. Their goal was to jack everything, pretty much. And the reason why is a lot of these Spanish men who came were, that saying that Trump says, when Mexico exports their people, what was it? They don't bring their best. That's literally what Spain did. They had criminals, rapists, just some of the worst people that Spain could have brought over to the Americas were here. If you can imagine somebody releasing a bunch of prisoners from the United States and sending them to a foreign country, and it's just saying, these Americans are behaving in a horrific way. That's pretty much what you were dealing with, with the Spanish. I mean, they had, for the most part, they didn't care about the people they were interacting with. And yes, you had your priests and you had, other people who were trying to pacify the situation or trying to, convert the natives. But still, I mean, it was never done in a way where it was, pretty. So a lot of the soldiers who came did that, right? But again, the land was not really settled. So you had a lot of areas that were pretty much barren. There was people there, but again, if you walked around these areas, you weren't going to see houses, you weren't going to see temple platforms, you weren't going to see, big cities, because the native peoples lived off the land, but they didn't own it. They didn't really feel like they owned it. They shared it with other natives as well. They traded with other natives. So the Spanish, when they did decide to settle these areas, there really was not much opposition, not always, I mean, obviously, right? But at the same time, yeah, they would, call these areas whatever they would call them. And then you had a population of 0 or very, very little, right? And if you don't have the resources to maintain a city or a village, I mean, your population isn't going to make it, right? So even when they established these cities or pueblos or villages, they had very little success in populating the areas because, like I said, the Southwest is pretty rough. Anybody who's ever been to the Southwest, if you're not from the Southwest, a lot of it is desert. Even today, if you pass through it, you're going to see very, very, very little, big cities in this area. So, And you can imagine back then, you're going horses and you're seeing nothing but desert for a long time. I mean, eventually you're going to get tired. So the Spanish claimed, this is a big thing. They claimed these areas for the crown of Spain, but never really conquered the areas. They never really actually settled the areas with a lot of people. So, the native peoples didn't even know that they were officially part of this new empire. They were still going about their ways. Those who never really came in contact with the Spanish. So, the ones that did, like the Pueblo Indians, some of them, converted to Christianity, obviously. In some cases through force, some cases, they actually accepted the faith. It was not always true that they came and slaughtered everybody. Some of them did accept it, right? Because Catholicism, the way it spread, not just here in the Americas, but really all over the world, they would adapt or they would adopt pagan practices in order to convert the people they were trying to convert. So that was very common, right? That's why, yesterday we were talking about, we weren't talking about anything, but yesterday was El Dia de la Virgen, right? De Guadalupe. That's one of the things that they use, right? There's a story about Juan Diego, Mexica man who, sees the Virgin Mary. You guys know the story. Anywho, that was one of the ways to convert people. So that's what happened as well, right? So in those cities that you had that luck where native peoples were converting to Catholicism or Christianity, whatever you want to call it, you would have bigger cities, right? And then California was probably one of the regions where the Spanish had a little more success with establishing some kind of settlement with all the missions. They had 21 missions in total, but they still were not that very big, right? Los Angeles and San Jose were probably the biggest areas, in California at the time. Excuse me. But out of the 21 missions, eventually became cities or towns or whatever. But this is way after the Spanish came, right? And then once the Spanish, claimed these areas, because they had a hard time, colonizing the areas or actually conquering the areas, they would send people from the lower castas, right? So mestizos, mulattos, even other natives from Mexico to go and settle these areas, because they knew that, well, we can sacrifice these people, right? They're already in a desperate situation. Most of them were never going to have a good life, in New Spain. So if we send them farther north, if they make it, they make it. If they don't make it, well, it's just a bunch of pardos or just a bunch of, mestizos or mulattos, that who cares about them, right? So as a matter of fact, we talked about this in session 2, I think, where the majority of the settlers or colonizers of Los Angeles were actually of, mixed heritage. They were mestizos and mulattos for the most part. They were not Spanish people, right? They were not full-blooded Spaniards, right? So these people who came from the lower caste in New Spain were actually the people who colonized this whole area, burps, our mouth farts. Yep. I guess, yeah, that's a good way to put it. But anywho, so that's what would happen, right? So these people who would come up here from the lower caste would come here, and then they would be attacked by some of the native peoples, or just they were not able to subdue them a lot of times. And if they did, they also treated them very poorly, right? Even so, you can imagine somebody who is mestizo, right, who's half Spanish, half native, sees these people as less than themselves, right? So again, that's colonialism, that's colorism, that's the caste system coming into play, how they saw themselves as more closer to whiteness than these individuals that they were colonizing. So you had that factor as well. Okay, so again, the Spanish never really conquered this area. They claimed it, right? They claimed it for, since the 1500s, really. And really, they actually claimed, many parts of not just the Southwest, but the South as well. You had Alabama, parts of Florida, even Mississippi. But again, they didn't have any settlements or any people actually colonizing the area. So they couldn't really claim the area and sustain it, right? And if you look at all European maps of colonial America, you see how the maps constantly change with France and the English, and even at sometimes the Russians were involved as well with this. So again, the Spanish, I'm gonna say this again, the Spanish claimed the area, but never fully conquered it, right? And this is going to be a big factor, in the next couple of things that I'm going to talk about. So eventually, once Mexico became independent from Spain in 1821, they, inherited this area as well, the Southwest, the parts that Spain had colonized or had claimed, again, not really colonized, as theirs as well, right? So on the maps, if you see old maps, as you see on the promo, you see a map of what is old Mexico. You have the Southwest as being part of it, right? But these were not states yet. You had Alta California, which was composed of California, and Arizona and New Mexico, Utah, Nevada. So these are all actually one big giant territory, but they weren't states. And then you had obviously the Texas, territory as well. So the individuals who did manage to make something of themselves in these regions, like Californios and Tejanos, the ones who were able to actually exploit the land like the other Europeans, they became pretty wealthy, right? So Californios would actually trade with Boston merchants. So merchants from Boston would come all the way to Mexico and trade hides, right? Because the cows in California, I guess, had a really good hide. That was their product, right? So these people owned huge ranches here in California. In LA alone, you had a couple of ranches, right? So where I grew up, the San Fernando Valley was actually a ranch. La Cienega was a ranch. I think San Pedro was another ranch. So these areas that have Spanish names in Los Angeles state to this day were actually ranches back in the day that the Californios actually owned, right? So during this period of from 1821 all the way to 1848, and before that, I mean, those, because LA was settled in 1781 officially by a number of individuals. So from 1781 to 1848, you had families who were able to, literally make something of themselves from the land, because I mean, like I said, there was nothing here. I mean, again, settlements. Again, there was people here, obviously, but there was no big settlements. And LA is a very rough area to live in. If it wasn't for the water that we steal from other parts of Northern Cali or Central Cali, LA wouldn't be what it was today. It would still be a very small village, very small town, but that made it explode into a huge city, right? So that was another factor. The people who did live here were using the St. Gabriel River as a source, and the LA River as well. If you ever come to LA, the LA River today is a terrible place to look at. It's full of concrete, not what it used to be, back in the day, but that is what they did. The Californios were doing that. And then in Texas, you had the Tejanos doing the same thing. As a matter of fact, all these, the term, buckaroo, comes from vaquero, right? So the Tejanos actually taught a lot of the Anglos and other, Europeans, the ways of being a cowboy or a cowhand, right? So you had these areas that were settled, like LA, and San Antonio, right? Santa Fe, that became pretty big, right? So, but not the whole region, though. Again, that's a misconception that the whole region was populated by a lot of people. Again, it was not. Even after independence, and even the Californios themselves and the Tejanos, saw themselves as Californios and Tejanos before they were Mexican. And a big reason why this was even the case was because, again, one, the term Mexican was fairly new. People were not calling themselves Mexican off the bat as soon as they became independent. For the most part, they were subjects of Spain. A lot of them, still saw themselves as Spanish. As a matter of fact, Pio Pico's father, who was clearly of African descent, referred to himself as an Español. And they were able to reinvent themselves here in Los Angeles because, back where they were living, they were clearly Black or of native ancestry. And the way to move up in society was to identify as European or Spanish, right? Or Hispanic. So they never really saw themselves as Mexican, right? Mexico City was so far off from LA and from these regions that they were self-sufficient. The government didn't provide anything for them. The crown didn't provide anything for them. They were literally living off the grid by themselves. So Mexican was a term that they never really embraced, or if they did, they called themselves Mexicanos de otra banda, right? So they knew they were different than the rest of Mexico, where it was a little more settled, right? Like Mexico City or just other big cities in Mexico, right? And again, this is going to play a huge factor into what's about to happen next, right? So for the longest, Spanish people, the Spanish government, the Spanish crown wanted people to settle the area, right? Yes, it was called Nueva España, yes. To settle this area that, we now know as the Southwest. However, again, it was hard. Even those who did come, very, very few individuals were successful. Most of them died, didn't make it, right? So the other plan was to allow Anglo-Americans to come from the east and actually settle the area. So in Texas, that was the case. The land was cheap. Anglos were allowed to come. It was perfect for farming. And a lot of the Anglos that were coming from the south and were bringing their slaves with them. So it was perfect. If you had slaves and you had, small plantations, you had a chance to have a bigger plantation and grow your slaves, and just grow as a businessman back in the day, right? So it was a win-win for them. You had the settlers. The deal was you're going to convert to Catholicism. You're going to become a Mexican citizen and just follow the rules, and a lot of them did for the most part. Most of the early arrivals actually did do that. They were converting to, Mexican culture or Tejano culture for the most part, and the only region that didn't really have that was, New Mexico. New Mexico was predominantly, Hispanic, and I say Hispanic because even the people there will identify as Hispano, before they identify as Mexican or even New Mexican. They call themselves Hispanos. A lot of them tie their roots to the first original settlers of New Mexico. And like I said, a lot of them were conquistadores. A lot of them were Spanish soldiers. So they even if they're not, they tie their roots to that. I mean, the majority of them actually are very mixed, but they identify with the term Hispano before they identify with the term Mexican. So again, these regions that were part of the Spanish Empire and eventually the Mexican Empire and Mexican Republic didn't really see themselves as Mexican, right? The three regions that I just talked about today. And again, it played a huge role, right? So eventually, long story short, Mexico or the Mexican government decides that, the immigration from the East is actually affecting Texas, because Texas was becoming predominantly white or American, or Anglo-American. And that was a problem, right? It's kind of ironic because, today we have areas in the United States that are becoming predominantly Latino or Mexican or Hispanic, whatever you want to call it. And we're going to talk about that in a minute as well. That's into the future, right? So again, that is what started happening in Texas, right? So immediately the government began to regret the decision to let these individuals come in. So the first thing he did is to try to ban them from coming into Texas was outlaw slavery, right? Because Mexico still had slaves as well. Believe it or not, Mexico had slavery as well, just like the U.S. It was just a little different. They allowed it before everybody else, though. And when this happened, obviously a lot of the settlers who were there did not take it well. They broke the law, continued to practice slavery, continued to bring in more slaves, and this became a problem. And in Mexico, at the same time, when Mexico first became independent, you had an empire, right? Because most people were so used to being ruled by a king that it was almost impossible for them to see themselves as being ruled by a president or just some kind of democracy. So they appointed an emperor, Agustín de Iturbide. And then shortly after that, he was removed. You had, I think, about 16 different governments or just, people in government going back and forth. So it was immediate instability in Mexico off the bat. That didn't help the situation, right? So it was liberals versus conservatives off the bat. Eventually, when this was going on, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna became the president. He was more of a conservative, and he took a more of an authoritarian style, and was willing to punish those in Texas who were not listening to the rules, right? But Texas was not the only place that actually revolted. It was actually a number of states in Mexico that were revolting against the country, right? So when it first started to happen, it wasn't like, okay, the U.S. is taking over the area. It was just something that was happening all over the country. So if you look at it that way, that's really what was going on. That didn't help the situation, So eventually, obviously, Mexico loses Texas during the Texas Revolution, and that causes problems, right? For the first 10 years, Texas is actually a country by itself, and the border between Texas and Mexico is not established until the I think 1840s, 1845 or 46. There is a dispute with the area. James K. Polk sends people over the river. Mexico sees it as an attack. They fire, and then the United States declares war in Mexico. A long story short, the region that we now know as the Southwest is officially conquered by the United States government, the United States Army. Not just the Southwest. The U.S. actually went all the way down to Mexico City, and they actually captured the city as well. So the U.S. had a very good opportunity to not just conquer the Southwest, but the entire country. Now, if you can imagine what that would have done to everybody living in Mexico, it would have changed the culture. Probably most of us wouldn't be speaking Spanish, or maybe very little, right? Maybe we wouldn't even have to move to what is now the Southwest. But anywho, the U.S. decided not because they were friendly or because they were nice, but they said there was way too many people to try to manage them. And the Southwest was less populated. So they said, you know what? We can take over this area and actually control it, right? The problem was you already had people here, like I said, even though it was not as populated, you already had people who were very successful. You still had native nations who had not been subdued by the Spanish or the Mexican government. So the Anglos, had that problem. But off the bat, they began to create more towns, especially, San Francisco, exploded after the gold rush. And California became a state immediately, right after that happened, right? So California, for the most part, became a very white state early on, as soon as it became part of the Anglo-American Empire. Texas as well, most of Texas, that's what happened, except in those regions that are, more Mexican or, Tejano, whatever you want to call it. New Mexico was the exception. New Mexico, again, had a very large, Hispano population. And the reason why they actually did not receive statehood until very late was because the government was afraid that this region would actually revolt or, have a lot of power because, again, there were way too many people that they could not control. And in California, all the people who own land, Californios, lost their land due to squatting. So the American settlers or colonizers, what do you want to call them, came to these regions. They literally just set up shop in one of the ranches, and the Californios would try to fight it off. But when they would take these issues to court, they were told, well, where's your land grant? And the land grants they were talking about were the land grants from the Britannic English, system, not the Spanish Mexican system. So they would show them pictures of what they own, and they're like, well, this is not legitimate, so therefore you can't really claim it. And that's how a lot of them lost their land. And also those who actually won their cases also lost their land because the fees to pay the lawyers were just so expensive that they were not able to keep their land. So they sold their land to pay off the lawyers, which was ironic. You had, rebellions here and there, but for the most part, they were stopped. So it was not until the Anglos that when the Anglos came to the region, more cities began to spring up, and this is where you really see the decimation of the native population. One, obviously, the diseases that Europeans, would bring to these regions. That was the first thing, and also just the way the English and just the Anglos treated the native populations was way different than the way the Spanish did. The English wanted nothing to do with them, right? The Anglo Americans wanted nothing to do with them. They were in the way. That's the way they saw the native peoples. The Spanish didn't see them as equals, but they at least tried to, Christianize them or try to get them to assimilate so they could be part of the society. But obviously, again, not all the native peoples accepted. So you saw more native nations become destroyed or just be put in reservations when the Anglos came and took over. And here in California, specifically in LA, it happened, way faster. It happened, the decimation of native peoples was way more during that period than the entire Spanish and Mexican period. So, like I said, the Anglo way of thinking when it comes to land ownership is way different than the way natives and even the Spanish, saw the areas. Right. So again, you started to see that, and this is what happened to these areas. So the Anglos were really the only true people who actually conquered these regions. And what I mean by that is that they actually settled the areas. They, decimated the populations. They, in some cases, replaced them, right? Excuse me. And created their own towns and, and in cities, that were not there before. And what they saw as a barren area. Right. So, and that's why a lot of them say, well, yes, the Spanish claimed it, and the Mexicans, obviously got it because of the Spanish, and the natives never really owned the land. Therefore, we're the first ones to truly exploit and conquer the land. That is why they make that argument. From a European perspective, they're correct. But if you're using a different philosophy, then, they're not, but anywho, to this day, since 1848, they've been the individuals who've been here since. We live under their system, their rules, their government, right? And a lot of people were rejected because of the history, right? It wasn't pretty, especially native peoples, especially those who Mexican descent or even Hispanic descent, and even those who immigrated to this area later, right? That didn't have any real connections to this area other than the land was claimed by Mexico and by the Spanish, but even they then say that this is a land, right? So to me, that's also really interesting. So obviously, after that, beginning in the 20th century, because again, it's really ironic that these areas that were claimed by the Mexicans and by the Spanish, they didn't really have a large Mexican and Spanish population until after the Anglos, took over the area. And one was obviously the gold rush. That was one of the things that caused major migration from this area. Two, the Mexican Revolution was a major factor too. The Mexican Revolution brought about way more people, than what do you call it? Any other migration before that. People were trying to escape war, so they settled in these areas that already had a Mexican population, a Mexican history. So this is where you begin to see your first waves. And again, crossing the border back then, it was way different. It was way easier, right? There was no walls, there was no fences, there was no INS, Minutemen, no ICE, stopping people from doing that. And then you had obviously the Depression. People were kicked out. Even Mexican Americans were kicked out from the region. So again, even more people began to claim areas that historically belonged to Mexican Americans and Californios, or just Tejanos or Hispanos, no Mexicanos. So that happened as well. And then you had the Bracero program in the 40s. As a matter of fact, one of my grandfathers was a Bracero. He came here in the 60s. I think that's when it kind of stopped. But he went through that whole thing, right? So again, that also encouraged immigration to the U.S. And then you had the civil wars in Central America, and right after the Chicano movement, because the Chicano movement was really the time where, you know, Raza here in this region began to make the connections to, you know, well, this has always been Mexican land, you know, this has always been, you know, native land. Therefore, we have the right to claim this land. And my counter argument to that is, yes, a lot of people came here from, you know, northern Mexico or northern New Spain at the time, and whatnot. But again, they never really fully claimed it or actually owned it, right? They claimed it, but never really, only in specific areas. And again, I'm not denying that, but the whole region, historically, they did not do that. And if you look at the settlements, again, you're not going to find too many all over the region. So to claim the entire Southwest as being a Chicano nation, I think is not correct, right? Yes, it was again claimed by these two regions, but sorry, these two you know, nations or countries or whatever, but they never really fully conquered it and never fully owned it. And again, and if you want to make the argument that the native peoples were there first, yes, you know, so it would actually belong to them. But then again, they didn't see land as the way, you know, other people do. So the ones who truly conquered it were the Anglo-Americans, right? But again, what does that look like today, right? Because all of these waves of immigration have changed these cities, have changed the Southwest, right? It's no longer just Mexican people who are here. You have people from Central America. Yes, the majority are Mexican still, or Mexican descent, or identify as Mexican, Chicano, right? But, you know, even those terms, even Chicano is a term that's slowly dying, I think. There's very few people are using it that I know of. I mean, other than the people who follow me, or I follow, or just I know are really into history. Most people who are not aware of their history do not use the term Chicano, or there's a new term called Chicanx, which I don't use as well. But that term is slowly dying, and it's because of this immigration, this constant immigration from different countries that are not Mexican, right? So you have that dynamic factor as well that plays a role into you know, what we are. So again, I'm going to go and look at the comments right now. I know I've been talking a lot for a long time. More stuff to come. Yes, mestizos are new people to existence, and only ones who were created in Americas because so-called natives. A very good point. Very good point. Buckaroo Banzai. It was Nova España before it was Mexico. Yes, it was. You know. All right. So I'm gonna look into a couple of stats where we were talking about identity, right? What does it look like today, right? Today in the present. Okay. So let me go and share my screen with this one right here. You can see a couple of statistics. Okay. Boom. All right. So in 2019, we surpassed 60 million, right? So when we're talking about Hispanic people, we're talking about those who identify as Mexican, Central American, Mexican American, right? Again, Hispanic is not a term that a lot of people, you know, prefer to use, but you know, in this case, to group all these people together, that's the term that they use. As you can see, from 1970 all the way to 2019, a huge gap. You know, like my boy Brown would say, you know, Latinos be fucking, right? I guess that is you know, another way to put it, you know. But yeah, you know, we're definitely the highest minority group in what is now the Southwest and really all over the US, you know. And we're 18% of the population. Yes. So again, as you can see down here, but with that said, though, I mean, from 2015 to 2019, there was sorry, 2010 to 2019, there was a decline in you know, growth, but it's still growing though. Still growing. If you look at some of the areas in the U.S., obviously the West or the Southwest has 14%, 3 million people. The Midwest actually saw, a big increase, and then the South actually, which is where my boy, the Chicano marketer, resides, saw a 26% increase. So Raza is actually going to places that we weren't even before, right? Before we were just in the Southwest. Now we're going to different places, right? The Midwest, you got Chicago, obviously, right? And even the Northeast, right? Areas. Again, these are not just Mexicans, these are other Latinos, right? Other people who speak Spanish or descend from people who speak Spanish, okay? So this is a very, very good point to make. And again, the areas that have the most Latino population, LA County, right? As of 2019, 49%. So basically half of the city is Latino or Raza or, Spanish speaking. Texas, Harrison County. You got Florida with the Cubans. You have Maricopa, Arizona, right? 31%. Riverside, which is also out here, 50%. San Bernardino County as well, 54%. San Diego, 34%, so on and so forth. So these are the regions in the U.S. that have a significant Latino Hispanic population, right? So, and these are, areas that historically have always had a large Latino population, and even more so, again, after, the Anglo conquest of the Southwest. Okay, so again, very, very, important thing to notice. Okay. And if you look at this map over here, right? So now we're looking at the future because we talked about the past. We're talking about the present. So what is it going to look like, right? In the next 50 years, right? Are we going to be the dominant group? Most people think that we are, we're going to be the most dominant group, minority group in the United States. And if you look at this map right here, right, these are the regions that are predominantly Latino. The light blue right here, right? So this is a hypothetical map of if the U.S. was actually, divided into different nations. If the Aslanistas or those who want to divide from what we now call the U.S. would have their way, this is what it would probably look like. And it's important to note that because, again, this part here, right, what is still part of the Southwest, again, doesn't really have a large Latino population. Again, going back to what I told you earlier, it wasn't really settled by the Spanish or the Mexican people. But it's been, settled by Anglos, that come from the East, right? But obviously LA County, most of the border cities or border towns are predominantly, Raza. You have some more here. Again, New Mexico, the majority of it actually is, Raza. To me, I was really shocked that California wasn't majority. It's actually just the Southern California. Most of it is, something else, right? So if hypothetically, if the U.S. would break into different nations, this is probably what it would look like, if this ever happened, because this is where we have the most influence. So the division of Aztlán, probably not going to happen anytime soon. And I say this because, again, one, Aztlán is a Chicano concept. And I know that Chicano is a very, loaded term, and many people think it's different things. But the majority of people, again, don't identify with the term Chicano anymore. Maybe in the 60s they did, but today they don't. And it takes a lot to really embrace the term, those who do embrace it. And even then, most who do embrace it probably do not believe in the concept of breaking away from the U.S. It's very, very minimal. And again, you have to factor that there's a lot of folks who are not Chicano, who, could be Spanish speaking, but don't identify with the term Chicano. So I think what we can get probably is, if this ever happened, is a Spanish speaking nation, as they call it here, El Norte. And again, this is hypothetical, right? So just something to look at. Okay. Let me see what else I was going to show you. Again, when it comes to identity, this plays a major factor as to why, again, people, this this concept of trying to, unify. And I gave up on this a long time ago. When I was younger, I wanted to unify our raza and be like, we ought to get together. But it's so hard to unify when we can even unify with one term. One, there's terms that were given to us by other people, by the government, by colonizers. Even in some cases, other movements, intervene and make it part of their thing. But today, this article here, what it talks about is how these different terms are also generational, right? So Hispanic is the oldest term that they use to group all of these people together, and the majority of people who identify with the term Hispanic are older people, right? As you can see here, it tells you what it means. I'm pretty sure you guys know what that is. If you don't, go look it up. This article is going to be posted. But again, this is the older folks, right? People probably in their 70s and 80s, identify with this term. Latino is probably those who, grew up in the 90s, 2000s, and then Latinx is the newest term, right? Which I don't use at all, is from the Gen Z generation, right? Again, incorporating the LGBTQ movement into this. So that also kind of crosses into that. And there's a lot of folks who are very conservative in the Latino community who don't embrace that as well. So that doesn't help the situation again, when it comes to unifying under one nation, under one ideology. It's very, very difficult if you can't even agree on a name, And one more article that I wanted to share, right? Again, Chicano, right? Chicano was a term that, the origins of Chicano are very, very ambiguous. Some people think that they, date back all the way to the Mexicano, Mexicano. Some people think that it was actually a term that was used against immigrants from the Native community, from Native Mexican community who came and worked on the fields. And that was the term that they used for them as an insult. Also, it was used for those who were born here. They were not seen as real Mexicans or poachers, whatever. Anywho, the term, was embraced by Zooters and eventually, students and other activists in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, maybe even up to the 90s. And then, Cholos also embraced the term. So it's evolved, it's evolved over the years. And today it's become Chicanx. Again, Gen Z has done that to it. But like I said, I don't know too many people who identify with the term anymore. It's very, very few. And if they do, it's a lot of older folks who identify with the term Chicano. A lot of times when I come across individuals, young folks, they prefer the term Latinx, younger people, younger than me. So this idea of having a Chicano nation, I think is just, very, very, wishful thinking. One, because again, it requires you to have the same ideology. Two, it requires you to get a buy-in from everybody, all of these Spanish-speaking people or descendants of Spanish-speaking people to buy into it. And thirdly, you would have to fight against the strongest military in the world, and it's very, very difficult, right, to do that. And then another factor that I forgot to share is that a lot of the people who do identify with that term or who do talk about trying to bring back the land again, to bring it back full circle to that, to the Chicano people, there is what was I going to say? Man, I lost my train of thought. This is what I was going to say. Most of those people who do identify with that or want to have a Chicano nation, again, are usually sons of immigrants, or maybe sons and daughters of immigrants, or second generation, the parents were here, or maybe in some cases Californios, or Tejanos who've been here for many, many generations. But the majority of them actually don't, and it's actually been proven that after the third generation, assimilation, takes a role, and they feel more Americanized, right? They actually feel more of a connection to the United States. And I mean, obviously, it makes sense, because if you're born here and you grow up with Anglo-American, values and culture, you're going to identify with that, more than often, even in these regions that are predominantly, like Latino or Spanish speaking. And in some cases, when you move out, they eventually identify more as American. So again, you have to take that into consideration. If you're talking about bringing back a Chicano nation, you got to play into that factor. There's a lot of raza out here that doesn't identify with Chicano. A lot of raza that doesn't even identify with Latino or Hispanic. They identify as American. So, it is something to think about when it comes to getting the land back or fighting the system, right? Again, that's my personal take on it. I gave up on that a long time ago. I know that I was more of an Aslanista back when I was younger, but at the end of the day, I think I've chosen more of the route of acculturation. I understand that my parents immigrated to this country that is now occupied by Anglo-Americans, and whether I like it or not, it is what it is, and I got to make a choice. Do I identify, or do I follow the rules of this current what do you call it, regime or whatever, or fight against it and really having a hard time trying to succeed, right? But with that said, though, the Southwest, and really, like I said, the whole United States is going to be eventually predominantly Latino or non-white, at least. So we do have to also consider that. Okay. But again, immigration will play a factor, right? If we continue to have immigration from down south, then it's going to continue to affect the areas. And if we don't have that, then most of us or our descendants are going to assimilate into American society. And that's why all the other immigrants who come from different regions, all of them came from Europe and didn't have to assimilate, they had to assimilate because those regions didn't have a large population from their home countries. And here you have many places that are Spanish speaking, so people don't have to assimilate for the most part, unless they eventually move out. So we do have to consider that our ethnic group is definitely one that is, has a big influence on what is now the Southwest under Anglo-American control. And I understand why people want to have their own country and why they want to be independent from, the Anglo-American Empire. But at the same time, if we cannot come up with any kind of unifying term, unifying philosophy, I mean, people can't stop calling each other coconuts or vendidos, and or gusanos or whatever you want to call these people. How can we ever get to that, right? I think if you really want to get to that, for those of you who are watching this and really want to get to that, my advice to you is that you need to unify with them first. Otherwise, there is no way that we're ever going to be able to have our own Chicano nation, or whatever you want to call it. But anywho, I'm going to go in and read some of these comments. I hope those of you who tuned in from the very beginning, I know this is a very long lesson, but to answer the question, who does this land really belong to? I would say that, all of these different groups played an influence in the settlements and the development of the Southwest. But as you saw, it's gone through different periods. And I think at some point, the Anglo period is going to end. Is it going to end tomorrow? Is it going to end in the next 20 years? I can't tell you. Is it even going to end in my lifetime? I don't know, but it's going to end. I mean, it's only a matter of time, especially again, I think if we continue to see immigration from the South, I think probably it's going to happen, sometime soon. But so if whether it's still under Anglo control or if it's something else, you have to pay attention to the community. You have to incorporate them. Otherwise, it's not going to benefit your country, whatever you want to call it. All right. So I'm gonna read some of these comments or if there's any questions. All right. I already read those. What's up, Quana? That's crazy. Yeah. My suggestions, that's crazy. All right. Well, where I'm from, there's a huge population of Mexican and Hispanic. Yep, I'm telling you, we're going everywhere, right? Mario Suarez was the first Chicano to use the term in the American literature. A lot of people still think it came about. Yeah, it wasn't during the 60s and 70s. It definitely came before that. It was popularized in the 60s and 70s during the movement, but yes, it came before that as well. Thank you for saying that. No, I was not smoking weed. I don't smoke weed. I'm just getting old. That's what it is, All right. If there's an American society left, times are getting pretty crazy. Yes, that is a good point to make. That's why I think that map that I showed you guys about the different 11 nations in the Americas, I think that's probably more realistic, where we do have some kind of division. It's going to happen that way, and we do live in a very, very strong time and crazy time where, the mandates and vaccine and, government overreach, we have all of that. It's making people push back against the government, but again, we've never had a government like this or a country or a nation where, they could just wipe you out if they wanted to. Back in the day, if you wanted to fight somebody, you could go toe to toe with them. But today, unless you got a jet, unless you got a, nuclear weapon, you stand no chance, So way different. The Chinese or Russians are going to be running things by the time process. You know what? That's probably true. See, that's that's something to consider too. And it's a time where I think we should be unified, not just as raza, but really as a whole nation, because the Chinese and Russians, and not the people, the governments, right? They will definitely take their opportunities, to do that. If I think, some folks praise the Chinese government because they're socialist or whatever, Marxist, and some, push back against that too because of that, right? But anywho, it's 8:03. I've been here for an hour. I didn't think it was gonna last this long, but it did. I keep farting from my mouth, like Lord Nemesis said. But those of you who tuned in, again, thank you very much. This was a very detailed lesson. And again, I wanted to talk about this because, again, a lot of folks who are on my page, constantly talk about Aztlan and, talk about native claims to the area. But again, I just wanted to give you the history of this whole area and how it started, where it's at now and why it is the way it is today. The irony is that I believe personally that if the United States did not, conquer this area, a lot of us wouldn't be here, right? Because the area probably would still be a lot like northern Mexico, very, very isolated from the rest of, the country. So, development comes with a price. Even in Mexico, when Mexico decided to develop the nation, it exploited a bunch of people, it killed a bunch of people. That's why you had a revolution in Mexico, but that's a whole different conversation. But anywho, yep, China is colonizing Africa right now. Exactly, right? Exactly. So you're going to have another colonizer, right? The U.S. is not the first or the last. As long as we're still here and there's still human beings, we're going to have people colonizing areas, invading other areas whenever you get a chance, So anywho, like I said, if there's no more questions, I did want to say this. This is going to be my last live of the year on YouTube. simply because I will be taking a road trip actually across the Southwest. And I will be also probably heading towards, Texas, maybe even, the South. So if anybody out here listening, I know Chicano Marketer was here earlier, I might hit your town up, man. And Missouri, I might be in Missouri, Juana, I know you're out there. You know, I'm not gonna be doing a live. I might do a IG live this week as well. But if I don't, then you're not gonna see me for a minute. But I will be documenting my trip through the page. So if you want to keep up and see where I'm at, I'll be doing that. But on that note, again, I wanted to share this very, very important lesson with the fans, with the followers, because I think it's really important to know about the history, especially if you're one of those people who want to go back and again reclaim the area, right? Just think about what that really means. Okay. On that note, this is Flo. Again, if you have not followed the page on Instagram, go and follow it. It's raza.stan. I'm also on TikTok. I don't do TikTok dances, but I'm on there too. That's where I post my my snippets of my YouTube channel. And as well, so on that note, this is Flo, Raza Stan. Take a stand